They built me on a Tuesday. I know that because Dr. Brandyworth wrote it down. He kept records the way old men of science keep records. Compulsively, precisely, in a handwriting that slanted left, as though it wanted to lean away from what it was describing. I found those records years later in a lockbox he'd left with a friend in Trenton, along with a letter addressed to me that he'd written and rewritten 11 times. I know it was 11 because he kept the drafts. He was that kind of man. The entry for that Tuesday read, "Subject transferred to carrier. Procedure complete. Carrier viable. Subject shows anomalous cellular response. Erickson has flagged for priority monitoring. Subject." That's what I was before I was Samantha. Before I was anyone's daughter. Before I had a name. Before I understood that the tingling sensation in my fingertips when I touched wet grass wasn't something every child felt. I was a subject in a classified weapons program run by a man named Steven Erickson, who worked for an agency that didn't officially exist, inside a funding stream that didn't officially exist, answering to a chain of command that would have denied all of it under oath and passed a polygraph while doing it. I want to be precise about what they did, because imprecision lets people off the hook they belong on. They took a woman who had nothing. No family, no money, no options. A woman named Polly who had come to the city looking for a second chance and found a recruiting officer for the directorate instead. They told her she'd be part of something important. They told her she'd be compensated. They told her the procedure was safe. None of those things were true in any meaningful sense. But the last one was the most damning lie, because they knew it wasn't true, and they did it anyway. And when the complications emerged, when the cellular resequencing they'd performed on Polly's biology began producing side effects they hadn't modeled, they didn't stop. They accelerated. They were building a weapon. They needed a chassis that could carry it. Polly carried me for 8 months under observation inside a facility that had no windows and soft lighting designed by a psychologist to reduce cortisol in the subjects. They monitored her blood, her sleep, her caloric intake, the temperature of her skin. They monitored me. When the labor began, they were ready with instruments and personnel, and a protocol document that Erickson had written himself. 12 pages detailing how to extract the asset and how to manage the carrier through post-delivery processing. Brandyworth was there. He'd been part of the program from the early architecture phase, before he understood what it would become. He had signed on for the science of it, the extraordinary and genuinely unprecedented biology of what they were attempting. He was a scientist of real ability in a field where real ability was rare, and Erickson had recruited him with precision, dangled the work in front of him, the actual work, the chance to see the cellular mechanics of human enhancement at a level no published researcher had ever reached. By the time Brandyworth understood the full purpose of that enhancement, he was in too deep to leave cleanly. He knew too much to simply walk away. And Erickson was the kind of man who understood exactly how much rope to leave before he tightened the knot. So Brandyworth stayed. He stayed and watched and made his records and wrote his drafts, building toward a Tuesday when he could not make himself follow the protocol. When the labor began and the protocol document said to transfer the asset to secure holding and manage the carrier toward the next phase of the program, Brandyworth looked at Polly and looked at the 12 pages in his hand and did what the 12 pages told him not to do. He took us out of there, both of us, me and Polly. He had a car and a contact at a hospital 40 minutes away, and a lie he'd been rehearsing for 3 weeks. He told Erickson that the birth had gone wrong. Told him the child hadn't survived. The carrier was in critical condition and would require extended care before she could be reprocessed. Erickson didn't believe him entirely. He had 6 other active programs and a quarterly review in 10 days. And Brandyworth was thorough enough in his deception that establishing the lee's full dimensions would have cost more than it was worth at that moment. So Erickson logged the loss, filed the paperwork, and moved on. He was patient. I would learn that about him later. The capacity for patience in the service of acquisition was his defining trait. Not the flashy patience of someone waiting for a dramatic moment, but the grinding bureaucratic patience of someone who understands that time is always on the side of the institution. He could wait years for the right moment. He had, after all, been waiting his whole career for an asset of this caliber. One setback was a data point, not a defeat. Polly went to prison 8 months after I was born. I don't know the full circumstances. The records are incomplete, and Brandyworth's letter was delicate on the subject, choosing words with the care of someone navigating a field that was still, in certain areas, mined. What I understand is that the cellular changes the directorate's program had made to her body didn't stop when I was delivered. She couldn't always control what happened near her. Objects would shift, reshape, move. Her mind knew what she wanted, and her biology executed it without her full permission, the way a reflex fires before you've decided to move. She hurt someone, she went away. Brandyworth placed me with a couple named Adam and Betsy Wilkins, who lived in a house with a porch and a vegetable garden and a retriever named Coach. They were good people in the ways that matter most. Consistent, warm, present. They read to me at night. They came to every school event. They argued with each other sometimes in the kitchen, and then resolved it before dinner. They gave me everything a child is supposed to have, and I was grateful for it in the manner of someone who is grateful for a language they cannot quite speak fluently. The grammar is right. The vocabulary is right. But there is something in the cadence that never fully arrives. I loved them. I want to be clear about that. What came between us was not a failure of love on either side. It was a difference in kind between what they were and what I was that widened over the years until it became impossible to pretend we were standing on the same ground. First noticed it when I was 4, sitting in the backyard, cross-legged in the grass, looking at a dandelion. I could see it. Not just the yellow head and the green stem and the white fuzz waiting to scatter. I could see the cells, the walls between them, the chlorophyll, doing its slow work, the water moving up through the interior structure in columns thinner than any needle. I could see the chemistry of it, the molecular machinery, and I could feel, in a way I had no words for yet, that I could reach in and change it, rearrange it, unmake it, make it into something else. I didn't, I just looked the dandelion down and went inside and ate the lunch Betsy had made me, and said nothing because I understood already at 4 years old that this was not a thing you announced at the table. Some understandings arrive before you have the language for them. The language for what I was would take years to build. The understanding was already complete. The years passed. I read everything I could find about chemistry and biology and physics, working through the school library, and then the public library, and then ordering things online that Adam and Betsy paid for without asking many questions. Because smart kids read, and they were proud of the reading even when they didn't understand it. The books on molecular biology and quantum mechanics that arrived at the house in brown packaging didn't worry them. They worried a little about the social dimensions, the quiet in me, the slight remove, the way I listened to conversations with the focused attention of someone taking notes. But they had no framework for understanding it as anything other than introversion. I had a best named Val, who lived across the street, and who was funny and fearless and entirely human in the way I was not. And I loved her the way you love someone who makes the world feel less like a test you're perpetually failing. She didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. She laughed at things that were actually funny. She was the first person I'd ever met who seemed to exist completely inside her own life, rather than watching it from one step to the side. I don't know how much she sensed about me. We never talked about it directly, but I think she knew, in the way that people who are close to something unusual eventually develop a feel for its shape. She didn't ask about the chemistry books. She didn't ask why I turned the conversation away from questions about what I could do. She gave me the gift of not asking, which meant more than she knew. At 12, something changed. I can describe it clinically now, from the distance of years, and the understanding that comes with having mapped my own biology in more detail than any laboratory has managed. The cellular resequencing that the directorate had performed on Polly before my conception, the changes that had been written into my biology before I was born, reached full expression. It's a developmental trigger, like puberty, but more absolute. What had been a sensitivity, a perception, an ability to see and barely touch the molecular structure of the world, became a capacity without a ceiling I could locate. I picked up my chemistry textbook to read a chapter on oxidation, and the book turned to glass in my hands. I sat there for a long time with the glass book. It was still perfectly legible, every page visible through the clear material, every word and diagram intact, the mass and the balance unchanged. I had not destroyed it. I had transformed it completely at the molecular level in the time it takes to draw a breath. The change was total and precise, and exactly what I had intended, without knowing I had intended it. Set it down carefully. I thought about what this meant for a long time. Then I went across the street and showed Val. That was a mistake. Not because Val was cruel, she wasn't. She was 12 and human, and I had just turned her best friend's textbook into a solid block of glass with my bare hands. And there are things 12-year-old humans are not equipped to metabolize in real time. The look on her face went through several stages in about 4 seconds, and I watched each of them arrive and understood each of them, and could not do anything to stop them. Surprise, fascination, fear. The specific social recalculation of a child who has just had her model of a friend revised at a foundational level. She backed away. Then she turned and walked quickly across the street and didn't answer my calls for the rest of the week. We were never quite the same after that. She was kind. Over the years, she was always kind. Val was constitutionally incapable of sustained cruelty. Something had shifted in the geometry between us, and we both knew it. And the knowing made every subsequent interaction carry a small weight it hadn't carried before. She moved away eventually. The summer we turned 15. We said all the right things at the goodbye. I think we both understood that something had ended years earlier. On the day I showed her the glass book, and she looked at me the way you look at something you've misidentified for a long time. After Val ran, I started going out at night. I don't know how else to explain it, except that I had to do something with what I was. I couldn't keep it all inside. The constant awareness of the molecular structure of everything around me, the prickling readiness, the knowledge that I could change any of it at any moment. I needed to use it for something, and the only thing that seemed worth the use was making sure people who couldn't protect themselves didn't have to face the worst alone. Time was a pair of men in an alley behind a convenience store on Marsh Avenue, doing to a woman things that didn't require my description. Them down, not gently. I rearranged the material of their environment in ways that made standing up inadvisable for the better part of an hour, and I made sure they had a view of what I could do, so they would think carefully before choosing that alley again. I left before anyone saw my face. I was 12 years old. I weighed 91 pounds. I was wearing a pink hoodie with a broken zipper. That night I made myself a mask from materials I found in Betsy's craft room. Nothing sophisticated. I was 12, and sophisticated wasn't the point. The point was the boundary. The line between Samantha Wilkins, who got up in the morning and ate cereal and went to school, and Adam Eve, who went out at night and did what needed doing. I needed that line to be visible, to myself mostly. The rest of it, the name, the visual, the whole business of presenting a coherent identity to a world that would one day have to understand what I was, that could be refined later. What mattered at 12 was the boundary, the decision that these were two separate things, and I was choosing which one to be in any given hour. The name came from what I could do, every atom, every eve of destruction or reconstruction, whichever was needed. I was 12, and it made sense to me, and I've had 12 years since then to improve on it, and haven't bothered. I had been doing this for 3 weeks when Brandyworth found me. He was older than I'd expected. Not that I'd had expectations, not knowing anything about him yet. He was a slight man in his late 60s with a good coat and careful hands, and he waited for me outside the mouth of an alley on a Wednesday night and said my name. My full name, Samantha Eve Wilkins. With the calm of someone who has been rehearsing the moment for years and has finally run out of reasons to delay it. He told me the outline. Not everything, not Polly's name, not the full scope of the program, not Erickson's name or the directorate's existence. Gave me the shape without the details. The way you tell a child about a diagnosis before you give them the treatment plan. He told me I had been born in a facility, that my biology had been modified before I was born, that there were people who knew about my abilities and would come for me if I kept using them publicly. The drone he mentioned in passing. The surveillance apparatus that had apparently already caught fragments of what I could do made the hair on my arms stand up in a way that had nothing to do with molecular sensitivity. He begged me to stop. He stood in that alley, this old man, with his careful hands and his good coat, and 12 years of secrets folded into the fabric of his expression. And he begged me. Shh, not dramatically, quietly, precisely. The way he did everything, with the specific weight of someone who understands the exact dimensions of the risk they're describing. Fear in his eyes was entirely for my sake. There was no self-interest in it. He wasn't protecting himself or protecting the program he'd defected from. He was protecting me, which was the one thing he'd been doing continuously since a Tuesday, when he'd made a decision that had cost him everything except his conscience. I told him I'd think about it, pressed a phone number into my hand, written on paper. Not a phone, not a digital anything, just paper in his handwriting, and walked away. I stood there with the number until the temperature dropped, and then I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket and went home. And for 3 days, I turned over what he'd told me the way you turn over a stone, looking at all the surfaces. I did not stop going out at night, but I was more careful. 2 weeks later, a drone fell out of the sky 2 blocks from my house. I caught it. Out of reflex, reached up and stopped it before it hit the street, examined it for the 3 seconds it took to understand what it was and who had sent it, and then dismantled it at the molecular level into its component materials, base metals and silicon and polymers, scattered like dust in the morning air. I was standing in my own driveway when I did it, and I understood as I was doing it that this was the worst possible outcome, not because I'd destroyed it, but because destroying it meant they'd already seen me destroy it. Whatever the drone had gathered in the seconds before I caught it was already transmitted. The value was already delivered before I ever touched it. I called Brandyworth's number. He was at my door in 40 minutes. He stood in the kitchen while Adam and Betsy were at the grocery store. And he told me the rest of it. All of it this time. The name, Polly, the full architecture of the directorate program, Erickson's role and methods, the 12 years of monitoring at a distance. He told me about the others. The children the directorate had continued to develop in my absence, in an attempt to recreate what I was, or build something close enough to be useful. He told me they were older than me, teenagers and young adults, and that they had abilities, real abilities, powerful in their own right, but not the same kind. The directorate's subsequent attempts had produced results that were strong but limited, or strong but unstable, or strong in ways that didn't fit the protocols the program required. He said they would be deployed against me. He said deployed the way you say a word you've been avoiding for a long time. The precision of someone who has been working around it in every previous conversation and has finally run out of circumlocutions. I asked him why he was telling me this now, after 12 years of watching from a distance, after letting me grow up without the truth. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands on the kitchen table. Then he said, "Because you are going to fight them. I know you are. I know what you're doing at night. I've known for weeks, which is more than the directorate knows, but not by much. And I would rather you knew the full details of what you're walking into before you walked into it." He was right. I was going to fight them. Not because I'd decided it in some clean, heroic moment. Just because the fighting was the only logical outcome of what I was, and what they wanted, and what I was not willing to give them. Sometimes there isn't a decision. Sometimes the situation has a shape, and the shape only opens in one direction. They came on a Saturday. The first one appeared on my street in mid-morning, a boy who looked about 16 with a loose jacket, and his hands in his pockets, walking with the particular studied casualness of someone who has been trained to walk without revealing their tension, and hasn't entirely mastered it. I knew immediately what he was. Not from the training, not from Brandyworth's description, from the air around him. A wrongness, a charge, like the specific heaviness before lightning but sourced from him, rather than the sky above. His biology was reading the environment the same way mine was, and I could feel the overlap of it, 2 tuning forks at slightly different frequencies. His name, I would find out later, was drawn from a directorate case number. They had not given him a real name. The case number told you his cohort and his capability class, and the date of his first successful test. That was the full extent of his official identity in their records. He stood on the sidewalk across from my house and looked at me where I stood on the porch and did nothing for a long moment. Long enough for me to understand this was assessment before engagement. He was reading me the same way I was reading him, getting the measure of what he was walking toward. Then the gas around him ignited. I moved before it fully formed, stepped off the porch and dropped the air pressure in the immediate area in a 3-meter radius, pulling the available oxygen away from the combustion zone before it could stabilize. The fire stalled, guttered, died. He looked at his hands with the expression of someone who has never seen that particular defense before, which told me he'd been operating in controlled environments, where the parameters were known in advance. He tried again. I kept pulling the oxygen. He tried a third time, and the fire didn't form at all, just heat and ionized air and frustration. He came at me physically then, close quarters, which was the right tactical choice in the absence of his primary capability. His body temperature was running about 40 degrees above standard, which made skin contact a significant hazard, so I went around him, staying out of reach while I built a containment, reshaping the sidewalk material, pulling the concrete up around him without touching him, rebuilding its shear chemistry from the base compounds into a configuration that would hold. When it locked, he hit it twice with everything he had. Left scorching on the inside surface. Then he went quiet. He sat down inside the concrete, just sat down. I don't know if he was exhausted or if he was simply done, but the fight went out of him like a door closing, and he looked at the floor of his containment with the expression of someone who hasn't stopped since birth and has just been given a moment to notice it. I stood there looking at him for a moment before I heard Brandyworth's car behind me. He was wearing a jacket with a tear at the right elbow that had been patched with the wrong color thread, the way you patch something yourself when no one is doing it for you. I thought about the 12 years between his birth and this sidewalk, the facility, the fluorescent lighting, the protocol documents, the hands that had never been gentle in the way Adam and Betsy's hands had been gentle, the case number instead of a name. Then the second one came around the corner. She could phase, move through material without displacing it. Walls, floors, other people, anything solid. She was tall, maybe 20, with the specific blankness in her expression of someone who has been told what they are for so long that they have run out of the energy to resist the telling. They called her Phase 1. I found out later there was a Phase 2, which should have told me something about the scale of what was waiting. She came through the wall of the house next door and emerged 3 meters to my left and put her hands into my chest before I could react, and I felt the wrongness of it. Her solid hands inside my solid body, and the involuntary terror of that was significant. I will not pretend otherwise. There is something foundational and irrevocable about having your body's exclusivity violated at that level. The animal part of you that predates language and reason reacts to it before the thinking part has a chance to intervene. But her hands were still matter, and I could still feel matter. I reshaped the space around her hands at the cellular level. Not her cells, not yet, just the material between us, the fluid dynamics of the 12-centimeter zone where she'd pushed through me. I made that zone rigid, not to trap her inside me, to make the phasing stop, restore solidity to a space that had temporarily lost it. She stumbled back. Eyes went wide with something I recognized as pure cognitive disorientation. Power had never failed in that precise way before, had never simply ceased mid-use, had never been interrupted by the target's biology rather than by external force. She was used to moving through the world as though it had no claim on her. The idea that something could claim her while she was mid-transit was outside her entire operational model. Said, I know you didn't choose this. I know what you are and how you got here. I know the people who sent you have no particular interest in whether you come back from this. She hit me with both hands. Not phasing. Physical. Hard, the specific anger of someone who has just had a true thing said at the wrong moment. I let her hit me, the 2 blows, and stood there, and didn't fall. And she saw that I wasn't going to fall, and her hands dropped. Then there were 3 more coming down the street, and a 4th one I could feel somewhere to my right. And behind me, Brandyworth was saying my name with a specific quality in his voice that I had not heard before. I handled the three on the street, the mechanics of it, the specific capabilities, the specific counters. I won't account for exhaustively, because the mechanics are not the point. One of them could manipulate electromagnetics, which is a terrifying capability with near limitless scope, and the reason he hadn't already disassembled every piece of metal in a 6-block radius was that the Directorate had kept his self-conception narrow. They trained their assets within parameters. Knowing the full range of what you could do was a form of self-determination that the program found inconvenient. I wind his understanding in about 40 seconds by giving him a demonstration, showing him the edges of what his capability actually was, in ways no one had ever shown him. The sheer vertigo of that expansion stopped him cold. He sat down on the curb with both hands on the pavement and stayed there, processing it. The second was a woman who could generate targeted kinetic force, focused pressure, precise and fast. She was the best trained of the group, and she came at me with clear intent and no hesitation, and something in the execution that looked like genuine purpose. Not obedience, purpose. She had chosen to be here in some way that the others had not, and that made her more dangerous, and also somehow more human in the encounter. I matched her for 2 full minutes, taking hits, redirecting, spending more effort than I'd spent on any of the others combined. In a different context with different origins, I think she might have been extraordinary. What they had made her into was a delivery mechanism for force. She was firing herself at me because that was the only option she'd ever been offered. I put her down carefully, changed the density of the ground under her feet just enough that each step cost twice what she expected, slowed her increments until she stopped. She looked at me over the 12 feet between us, and I said the same thing I'd said to Phase 1. She didn't hit me. She looked away. Then Brandyworth's voice went wrong. I turned, and he was on the ground beside his car, with a man standing over him. Not a weapon child, a man, an adult, in a gray coat with the precise posture of someone who has never needed to raise his voice in his professional life, and has therefore never developed the habit. He was holding a sedation injector at his side, already used, and he was looking at me with the patience I had been warned about. The patience of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 12 years, and considers the wait a reasonable investment. Erickson, he said. You're more impressive than the projection models suggested. He said it the way you'd say so the weather turned out nice. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the man who had made me, and I felt. I want to describe this accurately, not rage. Not yet. What I felt was a profound and specific recognition. The recognition you have when something you've been half understanding for years finally arrives in its full form. The way a room you've only heard described finally resolves when you walk into it. Here was the architect. Here was the one who had decided that Polly was a chassis. Here was the one who had calculated that the risk of Brandyworth's defection was acceptable, because the asset would manifest eventually and could be recovered. Here was the man who had written the 12-page protocol document for my delivery. Here was the one for whom I was still, at some level of his accounting, an asset. He told me Polly was alive. He let that land for a moment, with the patience of a man who understands how long it takes for information to reach its full weight. Then he explained it. She hadn't died in prison. The Directorate had arranged her situation. Her legal entanglements, her incarceration, her ongoing detention. They'd been maintaining her as a secondary resource, a potential source of data for recalibration if the primary program required it. She was in a facility. She had been in a facility for 12 years. She had no knowledge that the child she'd been told was dead was alive. And, standing on a sidewalk 40 miles away, fighting the siblings she didn't know existed. He told me this, the way you tell a card player about the card you're holding, calmly, with complete clarity about what the information was for. I looked at Brandyworth on the ground. He was conscious, looking at me with an expression I can only describe as apology, without words. Not the apology of someone who has made a mistake in the last 5 minutes, but the accumulated apology of 12 years of decisions that had led, with the inevitability of gravity, to this driveway. I said, "What facility?" Erickson smiled. We went. I want to be clear that I knew what I was doing. I was 12 years old, and I was going voluntarily with the man who had built me into the place that had held my birth mother for 12 years. And I was not naive about what any of that meant. I understood that his leverage was real. I understood that the cooperative posture he was presenting masked calculations I couldn't fully model. I understood that the best version of what happened next was going to cost something I couldn't get back. I went because the alternative was leaving Polly in a facility that I now knew existed, under the control of people who had already demonstrated what they considered acceptable use of a human being. That was not something I was able to do. The facility was not what I had been building in my head during the drive. I had been picturing industrial architecture, concrete and fluorescent light, the visual grammar of every black-budget operation I'd read about in the declassified histories. What it actually was a medical complex. Clean lines, good lighting, the quiet professional hum of a place where competent people do serious work. The horror of it was in the normalcy. The horror was that everyone who worked there had simply agreed, at some point in their careers, that the work was work, and the moral weight of the work belonged to someone else in the organizational chart. Someone above them who had made the relevant decisions and accepted the relevant responsibility, which meant no one who walked those corridors felt the full weight of what they were participating in. Erickson walked me through it, narrated with the ease of a man giving a tour he has given many times to people with clearances, in rooms that had protocols for everything. I cataloged everything: the layout, the materials, the structural composition of every wall and door and floor I passed. I was reading the building the way I read everything. At the molecular level, quietly, and the time when we reached the wing Erickson intended to show me, I had a complete material map of the entire facility inside my head. Every door seal, every ventilation junction, every load-bearing element, and every decorative one. Polly was in a room with a window. That detail mattered to me then, and still matters to me now. Someone had at some point decided she rated a window. I don't know if it was mercy or oversight, or as a calculation about optimal environmental conditions for a long-term research subject. What I know is that she was sitting in the chair beside it when the door opened, and she looked up. And for a moment I could see her trying to understand what she was looking at. She had my face, or I had hers, the arrangement of it, the structure of the cheekbones, the line of the jaw. I was 12, and she was in her 30s. And we had never been in the same room, and I knew her face the way you know, the face in a mirror. She said, "You're not dead." I said, "No." She said it quietly, almost to herself, in the tone of someone whose entire accounting of the last 12 years has just been handed back to them, with a correction that changes every column. Erickson let have approximately 90 seconds. Then he said my name and I turned, and the room had changed configuration. The door was sealed. 2 additional personnel had entered through a secondary access point I had already mapped. Brandyworth was being brought in through that door with his hands restrained, and his face was the face of a man who has run through every available plan and found none of them still viable. Erickson said, "The cooperation window is closing." He was not wrong, but he had made a specific error. He had brought me inside his facility. He had shown me the materials it was made of and the structure of it, and the relationship between every wall and floor and door. He had shown my Polly window. He had shown me Brandyworth's hands and the expression on his face. He had shown me what this institution was, and what it had decided it was acceptable to do. He had given me everything I needed to understand the full scope of what I was looking at. I reached into the molecular structure of the sedation system in the ventilation, a standard directorate precaution, the chemical compound they used to manage uncooperative assets, and I disabled it. Changed the compounds at the point of release from active agent to inert base elements. The change took approximately 3 seconds and was invisible to everyone in the room. Then I reached into the door seals and unmade them. Not violently. I didn't tear the doors off their frames. I simply removed the mechanism by which locked things stayed locked. Dissolved the material of the magnetic seals at the molecular level until they were no longer capable of holding. The doors swung open on their own weight, quiet and complete. Erickson looked at the doors. He looked at me. He said, "You haven't thought this through." I said, "Thought it through to the end." The question is whether you have. Then phase 2 came through the wall. I had not forgotten about phase 2. I had been carrying awareness of phase 2 since Brandyworth first told me the designation existed, carrying it loosely, not attached to a specific assumption, because assumptions about capability are how you get blindsided. The description I'd been given was incomplete, and incomplete descriptions of incomplete information make dangerous baselines. What phase 2 could do was more fundamental than what I did. It worked at the molecular level, changing the nature of matter, reshaping its chemistry. He worked at the structural level, the geometry of physical objects. He could change the shape of anything solid without altering its molecular composition. A wall became a sphere, or became a ramp. A confined space could become any other configuration of space with the same surface area. It was geometry as a physical act, applied without limit, and its implications for anything that occupied three-dimensional space were severe. He was 17 years old. He had spent 17 years in directorate facilities, having his capability measured and calibrated and pointed. He looked at me with the specific sadness of someone who has been told what they are for so long that they no longer remember what it would feel like to be something else. He was not angry. He was not frightened. He was just tired, in the deep way that people get tired when they have been doing a thing long enough and hard enough, and never for reasons that were fully their own. He came at me, and it was the hardest fight of my life. He changed the geometry of the floor under me, and I fell. The fall was not physical in the ordinary sense. The floor hadn't disappeared. It had simply reconfigured, and the angle was wrong, and my feet didn't find traction where they expected it. He changed the geometry of the wall behind me while I was still falling, and the new angle directed me across the room. I hit the far wall and was moving before the impact was fully processed. I kept moving, kept redirecting, changed the atmospheric composition around us to reduce visibility, which bought me angles. He matched every adaptation with the ease of long practice. He was fast and thorough, and his control at the structural level exceeded mine because his entire capability was focused on one thing, while I was working across the full range of material types in the room simultaneously. There is an efficiency in narrowness that I could not match on his ground. I hit the back wall, and he reshaped it around me. 3 seconds I was in a space that had no right angles, no flat surface, no edge I could push against cleanly. A pocket of geometry that his mind had designed specifically to hold me, the interior of a shape that did not correspond to any natural form. Every surface angled away from every other surface, so that force applied in any direction distributed outward rather than resolving into motion. Feel his effort in it. The concentration, the years of refinement, the way the directorate had taken whatever he had been born with and sharpened it to this single edge. I stopped fighting the geometry and looked at it instead. He had built a perfect container. It was, in the way that things can be, genuinely impressive. The understanding of spatial relationships it represented, the control required to hold multiple non-Euclidean surface angles simultaneously. I looked at it the way I'd looked at the dandelion when I was 4. Saw the structure of it, the molecular reality underneath the geometric intention. The container was stone. Shaped stone, yes. Profoundly reshaped, reconfigured into something that had never existed in nature, but still stone. Still calcium and magnesium and silicates in specific ratios. Still matter. I reached in and started working. It took longer than any of the others. He held the geometry through the first 40 seconds, while I unmade it material layer by material layer, changing silicates to sand, pulling calcium from the structural matrix, reducing the load-bearing properties of each surface one compound at a time, until what had been a precisely engineered trap was a loosely shaped aggregation of constituent minerals, settling toward the floor by simple gravity. I came out of it, and he was on his knees. Not from what I had done to his container, from the effort of holding the geometry for as long as he had. His hands were on the floor, and his head was down, and his whole body was trembling with the expenditure, the way a muscle trembles when it has been held at full extension, past the point of endurance. I went to him, knelt down next to him. I want this part to be understood clearly. I knelt down next to the person who had been trying to unmake my geometry 30 seconds earlier, and I put my hand on his back and I said, "You can stop." He looked up at me. His face in that moment was not the face of a weapon. It was the face of a 17-year-old boy who has just been told, for the first time in his life, that the thing he has been doing does not have to continue. He stopped. Across the room, Erickson had moved to the secondary access point and was keying in the hard lock protocol, the facility shutdown sequence that would seal every exit, flood the ventilation with the heavy sedation compound reserved for maximum resistance scenarios, and trigger the automated distress signal to whatever rapid response element the directorate kept standing by for exactly this type of situation. He was calm while he did it. He was the calmest person in the room, which told me something about the kind of man he was. The kind who feels most himself when the situation has exceeded the capacity of everyone else to follow him. When the room belongs entirely to the person willing to go furthest. I let him finish the sequence. Then I reached into the ventilation system across the entire facility and changed every active compound in it to its base elements: oxygen, nitrogen, the trace gases that constituted the standard atmospheric mix. Nothing sedating, nothing active. The hard lock seals on the doors were already failing. I had been working on some since the moment Erickson started the protocol, using the map I'd built during the tour, and they fell in sequence over 90 seconds. Quiet as breathing, the same way the room door had failed. Erickson looked at the doors. He had run the full shutdown sequence, and nothing had locked and nothing had flooded, and the doors were opening. He looked at me. He said, "You're making a decision you don't understand yet." I said, "I understand it completely." He reached inside his coat. What happened next I will describe without drama because it deserves precision, not theater. He had a directed energy device. Compact, directorate issue, the kind of secondary equipment that program managers carry in case their assets require adjustment in the field. He fired it at Polly. Not at me, at Polly. The calculation was simple and I had not modeled it in time. He did not need me to comply in order to achieve his objective. He needed me to understand, with the kind of understanding that settles permanently into the body, that compliance was always the correct choice, and that demonstrations of what non-compliance cost were available to him at any point, and that the 12 years during which he had chosen not to make such a demonstrations was itself a form of mercy that I had been wrong to interpret as limitation. Polly fell. Brandyworth moved. He moved faster than I would have expected from a man his age and his size. Crossed the room toward Erickson with the specific energy of someone who has been accumulating a debt for 12 years and has just been handed the moment and the means for payment. There was a struggle over the device. It was brief and resolved in the way that violent things resolve when one party has more to lose than the other. Brandyworth had the device at the end of it. But the device had already been fired. Erickson killed Brandyworth with a secondary weapon that the struggle over the first one had not removed from his possession. A second device smaller in his left hand. The kind of redundancy that methodical men build into their systems, because methodical men understand that single points of failure are the primary cause of preventable loss. Brandyworth fell. I am going to hold on that for a moment because it deserves to be held. The man who had saved my life before I had a life to save. The man who had carried 12 years of a secret that weighed more each year and had found no one to share it with. The man with careful hands and 11 draft letters and a lockbox in Trenton. He fell, and the room went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that follows irrevocable things. That specific silence which is not absence of sound, but the presence of something that cannot be undone. I looked at Erickson. He was breathing hard, not from fear, not from anything that could be called conscience, but from the simple physiological cost of the last 60 seconds. He was already recalculating, already adding Brandyworth to the column of acceptable losses, and Polly to the column of leverage applied, and me to the column of assets awaiting recovery. His eyes were doing the work of a man who has always operated in the margin between what is documented and what is done, and who has never, in his professional life, been asked to stand in a room where both of those things were visible at once. He said, "This changes nothing about the arrangement. I want to be precise about what happened inside me in that moment. I am not a person given to dramatic internal transformations. I don't have moments where everything changes, and I become a different version of myself. What I have are moments where the understanding I've been accumulating finally arrives at its full weight all at once. The way a structure becomes load-bearing not in the moment you finish building it, but in the moment the first weight is placed on it. I had been understanding Erickson since Brandyworth first told me his name. I had been understanding the directorate since the drone fell from the sky. I had been understanding what I was, what they had decided I was, since I was 4 years old in a backyard watching a dandelion. What arrived in that moment was not rage. It was the full weight of all of it, arriving simultaneously, with the calm that comes after. You have processed something completely and arrived at the only logical response that remains. I looked at the man who had built me and made my decision. I reached into Erickson's mind, not the way you'd imagine from a science fiction novel. I cannot read thoughts, cannot implant ideas, cannot rewrite personality or alter who a person fundamentally is. Can do is work at the cellular level of neural tissue. And neural tissue is, fundamentally, stored information in molecular and electrochemical structure. Specific memories are specific physical configurations. Specific knowledge is specific arrangement of matter. I unmade the specific physical arrangements that contained his knowledge of the program. The directorate's architecture, its personnel and locations and funding streams, the names of the children it had made, Polly's location, her identity, her connection to me, my origins and my capabilities as he understood them, the entire 12-year architecture of what he had built and what he had chosen to do. I worked through it systematically, layer by layer, the way I had worked through Phase 2's containment, not with anger, with precision. He stood there while I did it, and from the outside he became progressively less certain about where he was, about why he had come here, about what the room around him contained. By the end, he was looking at the walls with the mild disorientation of a man who has woken up somewhere unfamiliar and cannot reconstruct the sequence of events that brought him there. I left him his name, his baseline competencies, his technical knowledge, his implicit understanding of how to navigate a professional environment. Left him a life. I did not leave him the specific criminal architecture he had spent his career building. I removed it as completely as I had removed the seals from the doors. Quietly, at the material level, with no destruction and no violence and no remainder, he would be found. Someone would contact the appropriate people. He would receive care for what appeared to be a significant neurological event. He would be fine, in the way that people who have lost a substantial portion of their recent past are fine, diminished, confused, missing large pieces of what they knew, and entirely unaware of what used to occupy the space where the missing pieces were. I went to Polly. She was alive. The directed energy device had struck her arm rather than her chest. Whether because Brandyworth's movement had deflected the shot, or because Erickson's aim had been imprecise in the struggle, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. The injury was real and would require treatment. But she was conscious, and she was breathing, and she was looking at me. I sat down next to her on the floor. She said, "He told me you were dead. For 12 years he told me you were dead." I said, "I know." She said, "You look like me." I said, "I know." We stayed there for a while. The facility around us was completing its dissolution. Personnel evacuating through the doors I had opened. The other directorate children finding their way to exits or sitting down in corridors. The institutional machinery of the program coming apart in the absence of the direction that had held it together. I could feel the building the way I felt everything, all its molecular parts, and I made quiet adjustments as I sat there. Securing the thing that needed securing, opening the paths that needed to be open, making sure no one who was trying to leave would be stopped by anything I could reach. Phase 2 was sitting against the wall in the next corridor when I found him on my way out, with his back against the baseboard, and his knees drawn up and his eyes open, but not focused on anything in the room. I sat down next to him for a moment. I told him his name was not a case number. I told him there were people who worked with enhanced individuals who were not the directorate, who did not have protocols for assets, who would want to meet him when he was ready to be met. He didn't say anything, but he nodded. That seemed like enough for right now. Polly was treated. The injury healed. The directorate's knowledge of her existence had been removed from the only mind that had held it fully, and the records I had located in the facility systems during the tour I had quietly rendered unreadable at the storage medium level. Not deleted, just changed. The way you change the chemistry of a lock rather than breaking it. Someone would eventually notice the data loss. They would not be able to reconstruct what had been lost or why. There would be inquiries, eventually. There always are when classified programs collapse. Federal agents and lawyers and people with compartmentalized clearances and people without them asking questions and receiving partial answers and filing reports that would themselves be classified and stored somewhere that might be open 50 years from now if the relevant institutions chose to cooperate. They would not choose to cooperate. None of that was my concern. I went home that night. It was my birthday. I hadn't mentioned this to anyone, which was consistent with how I had always treated birthdays. As dates on a calendar, rather than occasions requiring observance. Adam and Betsy were awake when I came in, which meant they'd been worried, which meant they cared, which I knew, which was the thing that made all of it harder rather than easier. Adam was angry. Not cruel, he was not capable of cruelty, which was one of the reasons I loved him. But there was the specific anger of a parent who has been frightened for their child for several hours and translates that fear into its available expression once the child is safely home. He said things about responsibility and communication and the hour. He was right about all of them. And I couldn't tell him any of what I'd been doing. And the gap between what he was saying and what the night had actually been was wider than any gap I had navigated in 12 years of living in this house as this version of myself. I said I was sorry for worrying them. I meant it. I went to my room. There was a photograph on my desk, a family portrait, Adam and Betsy and me from 2 summers ago, taken in the backyard in front of the vegetable garden. I had knocked the frame over earlier in the week, and the frame had cracked along one corner, and I had meant to fix it for 4 days and hadn't. I looked at the cracked frame for a while. Then I picked it up and held it in both hands, and I thought about the photograph inside it, about what it represented, not a lie exactly. Adam and Betsy were real. Their love for me was real. The vegetable garden, the summers, the reading at night, Coach with his gray muzzle. All of it was real. All of it was mine in the ways that mattered. The frame had cracked, and some things are true about what they show in the shakul, and also incomplete. I made a different photograph. I made it the way I make everything, at the level of the material, building up the image from base compounds, the light-sensitive chemistry of it, the layers. I made the photograph I could not have had. Not Adam and Betsy and me in front of the garden, but something assembled from what I now understood. Brandyworth's careful hands, the quality of his expression in the kitchen when he'd told me the full truth. Polly's window in the facility, the chair beside it where she'd sat for 12 years. The face I'd seen when she looked up and found me not dead. The family that was not there and would never be there, and had still in some essential way been mine. Put it in the cracked frame. I set it on the desk. The morning would come. School would come. The ordinary machinery of Samantha Wilkins's life would reconvene. The commute, the classes, the conversations with people who did not know what the night had been and would not ask. That machinery had not changed. And I would move through it as I always had, with the slight translational delay of someone for whom the ordinary world is a second language. Learned well, spoken fluently, but never quite the language of origin. Had changed was the weight of what I understood. They had made me to end things, to be the instrument by which difficult situations were resolved with precision and finality, without the logistical costs of conventional ordnance. They had spent years and resources and lives building toward that instrument. And they had been right about what they were building. I was all of those things, precise, capable, without an apparent ceiling that anyone had yet located. They had assessed me accurately. They had simply not modeled the part where the instrument decided what it was for. The molecule does not mourn the compound it was part of. The atom does not grieve the reaction. I had Polly's face and Brandyworth's drafts, and Val running across the street and a boy in a jacket with a patched elbow who had sat down when I told him he could stop, and a 17-year-old in a corridor who had nodded when I told him his name was not a case number. None of those things were in the directorate's calculations. All of them were in mine. I turned off the light. The photograph sat on the desk in the dark, in the cracked frame, in the place where the ordinary family portrait had been. That is where you put the things you cannot change and will not look away from. Present, acknowledged, no longer subject to revision. Brandyworth would not get his letter sent. Polly would recover and live a life the directorate's remaining infrastructure could not reach because the knowledge had been disassembled as completely as any wall I had ever unmade. The case-numbered children were in various states of finding out what happened when the program that had defined them stopped defining them. The directorate had built me with one purpose. They had assumed soon that was the end of the calculation. That was the error. That was always the error. The assumption that the thing you build to win your wars will remain, indefinitely, the thing you built. That the instrument will hold its shape. That the precision you engineered will always point in the direction you aimed it. They built me to be final. They built me to arrive without warning and leave nothing standing. They built me to be the last word in any argument the galaxy wanted to have with the people who had sent me. They were right about all of it. They were just wrong about who I'd been sent by. I had decided what I was for. Had made that decision in a kitchen with careful hands across a table and on a sidewalk outside an alley, home, with a phone number pressed into my palm, and on the floor of a facility with my hand on the back of a boy who had spent 17 years being told what to do and had never, not once, been told he could stop. That is where the decision was made. Not in a single moment, in the accumulation of all of them. They had assumed the weapon wouldn't develop preferences. They are always wrong.